Hi, my name is Davis Aaron Anderson. I am Community Engagement here at Metro. We're here to hear the Web Archiving Building Description and Access session. Before we get started today, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar room. In the upper left corner, you'll see the attendee list. If you hover your cursor over any of the names on that list, you can start a private chat with one of the hosts or with another attendee. Feel free to start a chat with me at any time during this program if you have any administrative questions or technical issues. Below that, we have the chat box. Feel free to type any questions here as they come up during the program. We will be keeping an eye on those and addressing them all at the end of today's session, so please do indicate to whom your questions should be addressed. If at any time you start to experience technical difficulties, you can always close out of the room and re-enter with the same link. That resolves most small glitches more often than not. If audio problems persist over VoIP, you can always call in toll-free over the phone. We just ask that you mute your line by dialing *6 in order to cut down on background noise. Those numbers are currently in the chat box, and I'll reiterate them as needed. This session will be recorded, and I will include a link to that recording along with a brief survey and a follow-up email to you. Please take just a few minutes to fill that survey out. We definitely love feedback. So now I'll turn things over to Sumitra Duncan, our host for today's webinar. Sumitra is the Web Archiving Coordinator at the Frick Art Reference Library. In this role, she manages the Web Archiving Program of the New York Art Resources Consortium, also known as NYARC, which consists of the research libraries of the Frick Art Reference Library, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Brooklyn Museum. Sumitra also serves as the co-chair of the Web Archiving Special Interest Group here at Metro and the Archive at New York Users Group. Sumitra holds a BA in English Literature from Virginia Commonwealth University and an MS in Library and Information Science from Pratt Institute. Thanks, Sumitra.
Thanks, Davis, and good afternoon to our attendees. As Davis mentioned, I'm Sumitra Duncan, Web Archiving Coordinator at the Frick, and I wanted to thank you all today for joining us. This is part 3 of our 4-part Web Archiving webinar series on description and access. The 4th and last webinar in our series will be held on March 28th at 3 p.m., and we encourage you to register to attend at metro.org. Also, the next Metro Web Archiving Special Interest Group and Archive at New York Users Group meeting will be held at Metro on Monday, March 21st from 3 to 5 p.m., and you can also find more information about that on the Metro website. I'd now like to introduce our speakers today. First, we'll be hearing from Lily Pragil. Lily is a library consultant and has worked as the coordinator and systems manager for the New York Art Resources Consortium since 2007. With over 10 years of experience working with academic, special, and art museum libraries, Lily's areas of expertise include technical services and systems librarianship. Her work focuses on helping libraries with metadata, technology workflows, and collaborative initiatives. Lily recently implemented NYARC's Primo Discovery Layer, which allows users to discover the consortium's web archive collections alongside traditional research materials. She's an active member of the Art Library Society of North America, serving on the association's National Strategic Planning Committee. Lily holds a BA in English from Suffolk University and an MLIS from Rutgers University. Our second speaker today is Alex Thurman. Alex is the Web Resources Collection Coordinator for Columbia University Libraries, where he's been building thematic and institutional web archives since 2008. He's served on and chaired several ALA cataloging committees, including the ALCTS Subject Analysis Committee, and currently co-chairs the Content Development Group of the International Internet Preservation Consortium, working with far-flung colleagues to build collaborative web archives. He has a PhD in English and American Literature from NYU and an MS-LIS from LIU's Palmer School, and Alex is also made co-chair of the Metro Web Archiving Special Interest Group and the Archive at New York Users Group. Without further ado, I would now like to turn things over to Lily Pragil. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sumitra, and thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you about how we're approaching discovery and access at NYARC. Today, I'll be discussing how NYARC provides access to our web archives using 2 strategies. Since it's mid-afternoon and the time when I usually go for a pick-me-up, I'll offer you all a virtual shot of espresso and a snack. And when thinking about how to concisely summarize our strategies, I began looking for metaphors to describe the convergence of 2 paths. And I must have been hungry because this is what I came up with. I'll characterize our discovery and access methods as using the chocolate and peanut butter approach. Our 2 strategies are, first, to leverage the full text indexing of our ArchiveIt collections, and second, to create MARC records for the seeds in those collections. Like the tasty snack of chocolate and peanut butter, both strategies are good on their own, but together they enrich the experience. We believe that descriptive metadata and full text indexing are both essential to drive discovery and retrieval of web archives. I know some of you have heard from my colleague Sumitra, who presented in the first installment of the series about the NIARC web archiving program. For those of you who might be new to the series, I'll give you some brief background about who we are and about our adventures in web archiving to provide context for this talk. NIARC, as Davis just mentioned, stands for the New York Art Resources Consortium, which includes 3 museum libraries in New York City, the Brooklyn Museum, the Frick Collection, and the Museum of Modern Art. We are actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year, and our first project began in 2006 with the creation of a joint ILS. We call our joint ILS Arcade, and it was launched in 2009. Since that time, we've worked very closely together to continue to improve access to art research materials. In terms of web archiving, our investigation into creating a web archive collection began in 2010 with an intern and a pilot project using ArchiveIt to capture auction house catalogs, which were quickly migrating to the web. Following that pilot, we received support from the Mellon Foundation for an exploratory grant called Reframing Collections for a Digital Age. The grant allowed us to investigate the tipping point from print to digital in the publication of art research materials. It also allowed us to look at harvesting models and investigate the infrastructure and workflows needed to develop and support a web archiving program. During this investigation, it became very clear that more robust discovery mechanisms and metadata practices needed to be developed to help researchers find web archive content. In 2013, we received a 2-year implementation grant, again from Mellon, that we called Making the Black Hole Gray, which is a reference to the digital black hole we were contributing to by not actively collecting born digital and web-based materials. This grant is what ignited the NIARC web archiving program, and it really got us going. What I'll be talking about today, specifically the development of our Primo system called NIARC Discovery and the NIARC metadata profile for web archives, is the direct result of the Making the Black Hole Gray implementation grant. Our final report detailing outcomes of the grant was just made available online. All of the projects that I referred to here have reports that are available on the NIARC.org website, and links will be provided to all the documents at the end of the slide deck. So here's a quick snapshot of our web archive collections as they exist today. We have 10 collections broken up into thematic and institutional categories. The thematic collections include art resources, artist websites, auction houses, catalogs raisonnés, New York City galleries, and sites that focus on the restitution of lost or looted art. The institutional-based collections include the 3 sites of the NIARC institutions and the consortium's own website. And right now we're capturing about 250 websites, but nominations from staff come in on a regular basis. So how are web archives accessed? Many of you are probably familiar with the public Wayback Machine, and as you know, that can only be searched by a known URL. If you know the URL of the page that held the content you're interested in, you're in luck. Otherwise, there's no other mechanism for exploring the Internet Archive's 439 plus billion web captures. It should be noted that the Internet Archive recently announced that they are rebuilding the Wayback Machine, which is projected to be completed in 2017. Their plans include indexing the home pages of websites to allow for keyword access to the captured content, but they acknowledge that indexing all of the captured pages is beyond what they can do. ArchiveIt, as I'm sure many of you know, is the Internet Archive subscription service, allowing institutions to curate their own web archive collections, and that's the tool that we use at NIARC. On the ArchiveIt platform, users can retrieve materials using a keyword search within a collection page. ArchiveIt also has a Dublin Core template that can be used to enter metadata at the collection, seed, or document level to facilitate search and browsing. Beyond Wayback and ArchiveIt, others have developed locally created discovery platforms for their web archive collections, including Columbia University, and you'll be hearing more on that from Alex. So while we use ArchiveIt to create and manage our web archives, We didn't want to create another silo of content that our users had to search independently. Our team felt that it was a barrier for researchers to find and actively use our web archive collections. We wanted to leverage Archive.it's full-text indexing and integrate the web archive results alongside results from our print and electronic collections. Essentially, we needed to create a format-agnostic single search experience. To do this, we implemented Primo, which is Ex Libris's discovery platform. Primo unites the over 1 million records in Arcade, our joint catalog, with results from our Archive.it system, in addition to other electronic resources such as article-level indexing from JSTOR, ArtStore, and other aggregators. We call our Primo installation NIARC Discovery. The system is still quite new for us, and we've recently just dropped our beta status. And we are now beginning to actively promote NIARC Discovery to the broader community, and I hope all of you will give it a try and send me your feedback. As you can see from the screenshot here, there's a send us your feedback link right at the top of the screen. So I'll go ahead and walk through this screenshot to explain the integration. Here we have a search for Maya Angelou's art collection. On the left-hand side, you'll see a checkbox that says Display Web Archive Collection Results. This checkbox displays or hides the HTML code controlling the web archive results on the interface. The default setting is checked, so when a user searches NIARC Discovery, they retrieve web archive results by default. Using the checkbox, users can easily include or exclude these results. So following the first result is where you'll find the web archive result coming from Archive.it, and that's highlighted with the red rectangle here. The web archive results are being retrieved by using Archive.it's OpenSearch API. Primo is not harvesting the results, or is not harvesting the results at all, but just simply leveraging the full text indexing happening on the Archive.it platform, and then dynamically displaying those results within Primo. Unfortunately, there, thank you. Just had a momentary glitch there. So essentially, Primo is going out, it's using the API to go out, retrieve the results, and bringing them back and plugging them into the interface. And this is all happening in real time. The integration here uses a JavaScript file to call the API, and HTML and CSS are used to display the results in a way that matches the look and feel of the interface. When we were exploring possible discovery systems, we made the integration of our Archive.it collection a functional requirement and pressed vendors for a proof of concept to demonstrate how the integration would work. We knew about the availability of the OpenSearch API that's available to any Archive.it partner, but it was Ex Libris who developed this solution for us. We think that this integration of our Archive.it collections is unique among Primo customers, and it's now something that any other library using Primo and Archive.it can use. I'm working with Ex Libris to get the code and instructions made available on GitHub, but I'd be happy to share their details sooner, so just contact me if you're interested. Okay, so back to the interface. We've also added an information icon to the label to attempt to explain what our web archive is, as it's not something researchers are very familiar with. When they hover over the little eye icon, they get the hover text that's included on the slide below. We've also provided a website icon to the results as a visual cue regarding the format of the content. And here you see the little website icon. From the result, the user can click on the View Archived Website link, View All Versions link, which brings them to the calendar page of captures for the seed, or they can go to Archive.it directly to view all the results for their search terms. Excuse me. During implementation, our Discovery Working Group decided to retrieve and display only the first Archive.it result, but the setup can be customized to display as many results as you'd like. In this example for Maya Angelou art collection, you'll see that the first result is the physical auction catalog held at the Frick Art Reference Library for the sale of her collection. The web archive result is a capture from the auction house website that hosted the sale. And following that View Archived Website link, this is where you come to the captured content on the Archive.it page. The capture provides the user with immediate access to information about that sale without having to physically come into the library to browse the catalog. In this case, we have the physical catalog, but in many cases, catalogs are now only being made available online. So web archiving is a necessary collection development approach to identify and capture this content. It's also important to consider that websites often have additional information that never makes its way into the print publication. In this case, that includes auction sale results and prices paid for artwork at auction. Driving down a little deeper in this example, here we see the full text results provide enhanced access to the content of that sale. Searching for a work of art produced by Romare Bearden, known to be in Maya's collection, we are directed to the page in the online catalog that displays that artwork. Without access to the Web Archive collection, the researcher would have had to browse a library copy of the auction catalog to discover this content, or may not have found the physical auction catalog at all, as individual artworks included in the sale are typically not included in catalog records. This is the beauty of leveraging the full text indexing, providing users access to content that would otherwise be difficult to locate or impractical to catalog on such a granular level. Here's just another example, and here this highlights how content from our blog is being surfaced within our Primo installation. A search was entered for El Techo de la Balena, an artistic and literary collective active in the 1960s in Venezuela. And you'll see that a handful of formats are returned in our result list. We've got a couple of books and an archival record of the collection held at MoMA. But we also retrieve a link to the blog post written by MoMA's Latin American bibliographer that provides more context to the collection materials and actually highlights the writing contributions of our staff. So while making use of the full text indexing is one approach, it doesn't provide the precision of searching structured metadata. The creation of bibliographic records for our captured content is an important and necessary part of our workflow. For our collections to be discoverable to researchers, they must not only be better integrated in local systems, but they must also be discoverable in network-level systems such as WorldCat. To achieve this, we've been creating seed-level records using the MARC format. This approach harmonizes with our current cataloging procedures for analog materials. The scalability of this approach is not lost on us, especially when thinking about embedded documents that warrant their own bibliographic description. At the moment, we are taking an incremental approach in creating MARC records and seeing where the full text indexing fills in the gaps. You could say that we're producing a data-rich product in small batches, sort of like making fine chocolate. Before we look at a record example, let's talk about the formation of these records. The question of how to approach the description of web archives, which fields to include, how to describe the archived aspect of these resources, has been a task taken up by our consultant on the project, Rebecca Gunther. Rebecca worked with NIARC catalogers and partners, including our colleagues at Columbia and the research group at OCLC, to develop a metadata profile for describing web archives. Here is a screenshot of one page in that profile. This details the use of MARC field 583, or the action note, which we use to record the capture event. As you can see, the profile is concise and clear, containing usage notes along with mapping status schema, including Dublin Core, VRA, BibFrame, and more. This profile guides our practice and is available at the link on the slide, and we hope it will be useful to the community. Cataloging is distributed across the consortium and integrated into the existing workflow of our cataloging staff. We currently also have graduate interns helping us with this work. For us, cataloging starts in OCLC's connection client, where we use the extract metadata feature to automatically generate a brief MARC record. Once you plug in the URL, metadata is extracted from the site and mapped to MARC fields. This extraction tool has varying degrees of success, as it's based on the meta tags the site does or doesn't use in its coding. We'd like to see OCLC enhance this tool to make it RDA compliant and include constant data that could reduce the amount of editing required by catalogers. But once we have our brief MARC record, we then apply our local constant data template for cataloging web archives. When the cataloger completes the record edits, the record is added to WorldCat and it's exported to our catalog, which then makes its way into NIARC Discovery. I won't go through the marked details on the slide, but I wanted to include our local constant data for web archives for anyone who's interested to look at them offline. And this is courtesy of my colleague Mark Bresnan and at the Frick, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about this following this meeting. So let's look at the record in various systems. Here's an example record for the Dawson-Watson catalog resume. And Dawson-Watson, if that's not a name that's familiar to you, was a British impressionist. Here you see a screenshot for the Dawson-Watson catalog resume record in WorldCat. You'll notice that the record contains two links, one for the live site and one for the archive site. This is a practice that we adopted from Columbia. The archive link points back to our captured website in our Archive It collection. The thinking behind this is that if there's link rot and that live site URL no longer resolves, that archive site will still be in the WorldCat record and at least serve as a memento and a way for people to access that captured content. And this is the same record in our local OPAC called Arcade. And again in NIARC Discovery. And you can see the two links are here as well. I hope that these examples that I've demonstrated why we think this dual approach of leveraging the full text indexing of our captures along with the creation of MARC records with structured access points is necessary. We think that it perhaps combines the best of both worlds, like chocolate and peanut butter. So while what I've described here as the NIARC approach, we are still in the early days of understanding users' needs when it comes to web archives and how best to describe them for discovery. Research is underway by various groups to learn more on a whole range of web archive topics, from using big data approaches to defining preservation metadata standards. Recently, OCLC convened a web archive metadata working group that will evaluate different descriptive metadata approaches and recommend best practices. Rebecca Gunther, Alex, my fellow NIARC colleague Debbie Kemp, and I are on that group with a number of other metadata specialists from research universities and institutions. We're all looking forward to see how our practices evolve based on the outcome of those discussions. So I'll leave you with a number of resources to our documentation that I've referred to in this talk and my contact information. So thank you very much. Thanks for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions following Alex's talk, or just send me an email or reach out to me via Twitter. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Lily. I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Alex Thurman, and I'm the Web Resources Collection Coordinator at Columbia University Libraries. Today I'll start by raising a few considerations that I think are generally relevant to describing web archives, and then move into examples of practice, mostly related to how we've created metadata for web archives at Columbia University Libraries. Our practices, of course, aren't necessarily best practices, and you'll see that they're quite flexible, varying according to the needs and natures of different collections. But hopefully that flexibility will resonate as one element of best practice. Many of my slides today will consist of screenshots related to web archive metadata, and most of those screenshots will be linked to their source, so you can click through and look more closely at anything of interest, though I won't be doing so during the presentation myself. So we all find content on the live web by a combination of searching and browsing, and that is equally true for archived web content. But the difference is that archived web content is much more siloed, and so finding it depends greatly on the presence on the live web of descriptive metadata about the archived web content. Decisions about web archive description are first driven by an institution's rationale or use case for archiving web content, whether the goal is archiving an institution's own web presence, preserving a national domain as cultural heritage, building thematic library collections from freely available web resources, or simply citing archival URLs to avoid link rot, will affect the cataloging traditions and associated standards followed. A related key factor is the granularity of the object of description, which can be driven by institutions' use cases and the type of staff charged with performing the web archiving. Some basic levels of granularity to consider include web archives as a whole, or meta collections, websites, documents, such as individual HTML pages, PDFs, videos, etc. The highest of these levels is web archives as a whole, or what might be called meta collections. The UK Web Archive, for example, is the British Library's searchable collection of web archive collections, which is, most of those collections are thematic, event-based, etc. Also, all Archivit partners' collections taken together form a distinct archive that can be searched and browsed at archivit.org. Browsing the collection level and seed level metadata exposed in the facets displayed there underlines the fact that the hundreds of active Archivit partners vary widely in how they structure collections and describe them. These meta collections may not typically require descriptive metadata per se, but they are critical entities for access and do require identification and characterization. The Memento time travel for the web portal, which is the most inclusive federated web archive URL search portal, queries the automated capture metadata from several distinct web archives, including the UK Web Archive, Archivit, Internet Archive, Global Wayback, etc. And for efficiency in searching these huge meta collections, the Memento team has explored creating technical profiles characterizing the content of the different archives. So the idea of describing and differentiating entire web archives is not purely abstract. Moreover, all Archivit partners with more than one defined collection are themselves the proprietors of a meta collection, in the sense that we each have an institutional collection page where our own web collections as a whole can be searched or browsed, as on this slide for Columbia. The information displayed against the green background in this slide represents archive-level descriptive metadata. And we also have to think about whether or how to describe our Archivit-hosted web archive or its collections in our local discovery environments to integrate access to web archives with our other types of resources, as NIARC and Lily have done so well. Columbia will be adding a new access point to its web archives in the main list of resource types under Find on its library website. And that link will lead to a list of all of our collections with more customized contextual information than is easy to provide within Archivit itself. The next and most important granularity level is collections, a concept that means many things and has a long history in libraries and archives. But in the context of web archiving generally, it connotes a distinct, separately searchable bucket of target web resources, organized around some common theme, event, or domain. Columbia has 7 web collections, shown here along with some statistics, and these are all active collections. They include thematic web collections in human rights, historic preservation and urban planning, and New York City religions, a university archives collection including virtually all of the Columbia EDU web domain, and 3 other smaller collections. In a separate Archivit partner account called Columbia University Libraries Consortial Collections, Columbia also hosts 2 other Mellon-funded pilot collections that were created collaboratively with librarians from the other 11 universities in the Ivy Plus group. These collections are Causeway, the Collaborative Architecture, Urbanism, and Sustainability Web Archive, and CCWA, the Contemporary Composers Web Archive. The collection is the most significant level of granularity in traditional archival description, where collection-level finding aids are created to combine high-level contextual information about the collection with hierarchical organization and description of its narrower units, such as series or subseries. At Columbia, where our web archiving program arose as a library collection development initiative and is based in the Bibliographic Services and Collection Development Division, and more narrowly in the Original and Special Materials Cataloging Unit, MARC records were the natural choice for our web archives metadata. The slide shows our Clio catalog collection level MARC record for the Avery Library web collection. The record provides a high-level description of the collection and links to the Archivit collection page, which itself has a full listing of the 140 individual websites in the collection with detailed descriptive metadata, as well as automatically generated capture date ranges, and is kept up to date directly through our normal Archivit workflows. By contrast, a finding aid that aspired to include a full seed list and/or capture date information and to be kept up to date would have to be regularly updated in addition to Archivit workflows. That's one of the reasons that we've not gone that path. However, some web archivists, particularly those who are full-time university or state archivists for whom web archiving is an added responsibility and who don't themselves routinely do item-level cataloging, naturally prefer collection-level description via finding aids. And for balance, I'll supply a good example of one such web archive finding aid here as well. This slide shows the University of Wyoming's online finding aid for its Matthew Shepard Web Archive, which was created in 2008 after the conclusion of crawling for the collection. What is relatively rare about this web archive finding aid is that it doesn't indeed include the full list of seeds in the collection, distributed into series within the container list, as in a traditional finding aid for physical materials. I imagine that this was feasible because the collection was completed. If the collection was continuing to add new seeds and crawls, as all of our Columbia collections are, continually updating such a finding aid would be burdensome. Another interesting consideration is that the traditional archival organization of items into particular series and subseries ultimately refers to the reality of the physical storage of the material into a particular box or folder, something that's not needed for items in a web collection. Archivit, though, does have a group feature external to its Dublin Core metadata template, so subdividing collections into mutually exclusive groups reminiscent of archival series remains possible there. This slide shows Columbia's Archivit collection page for the Human Rights Collection, and on the upper left you can see that we've chosen to use the group function to divide the seeds according to the type of creator, which is a category that would only have one value for each seed, and which doesn't neatly map to any of the provided Dublin Core fields. Arranging subsets of seeds using the group function yields a distinct access point or URL for that subset, which can be useful. But as of yet, full-text search cannot also be limited to the seeds in a group. Search queries always apply to the collection as a whole. So for web archivists considering whether a set of seeds should be their own collection or a group within a larger collection, the question of whether search granularity is needed is important. The level of granularity where the vast majority of Columbia's Web Archive metadata takes place is at the seed or website level, where we provide at least Archivit Dublin Core metadata for all collections and supplement with website level MARC records for some collections. We use LCSH subject headings and LCNAF name headings when available, and our decisions about what metadata to supply have depended in part on the nature of each collection. So returning to this slide with our collection statistics, the first two collections we started at Columbia were the Human Rights Collection and the Historic Preservation and Urban Planning Collection. For both of these subjects, Columbia Library's subject specialists had long been acquiring materials in their areas of expertise in all formats, knowing that they'd be cataloged and findable in Clio. And part of the rationale for expanding into web archiving was filling gaps in our print collection and adding electronic access for some materials that we were already owned in print. So as these same librarians began nominating seed websites for these web collections, it was natural for them and for our catalogers to view the archived websites as another form of bibliographic resource to be cataloged with MARC records and found in Clio. The Brooke Library New York City Religions Collection, by contrast, was conceived as a kind of cross-section or survey of religious activity in New York City, as recorded on the websites of many of the city's places of worship from all faith traditions. These sites mostly do represent organizations like the previous two collections, but these religious organizations are far less likely to have reports or serials or other document-like content of research interest. And so we think of these sites in a less bibliographic context. Consequently, no MARC records were created for these sites, but we still felt that navigating the collection would be much enhanced by relevant Archivit metadata And here we took full advantage of Archivit's feature allowing custom metadata fields to be defined and populated. So as you can see on the slide, we have custom fields for religious tradition and religious subtradition. And the librarians from the Burke Library who selected the websites for the collection also produced a bi-level thesaurus of values for the religious traditions and religious subtraditions fields, and we added these as custom fields. Also, since almost all of the included sites have a physical street address in New York City, we collected those addresses and other locational metadata fields in another custom field, and we aspire to use them in a map layer within the library website to help users visualize the data in the collection. So many institutions get started in web archiving with the use case of archiving their own institutional web presence, and thus view it within a traditional archival frame of reference. But Columbia didn't. We did, however, early on see the value of Archivit for archiving the Columbia web domain and set out to do so in 2010 experimentally using the widest possible scoping and test crawls, which was using a base seed of www.columbia.edu with a scope expansion to include any other URL with a Columbia edu in it, as well as adding about 100 affiliated sites with non-Columbia URLs as separate seeds. So we did experimental captures of under those scoping rules just to see how large the domain was, and we realized that with some selective limiting scope, we could fit an annual capture of most of the university domain into our Archivit budget. Since then, we've worked more closely with the university archivist to prioritize types of content for particular attention, and her areas of special concern for preservation were online course bulletins and student publications. And she also asked for semi-annual captures to more closely align with the two-semester academic year. So we've captured a lot, which is about 365 gigabytes of Columbia web data since 2010. But until recently, we had provided no seed-level metadata for this collection, other than for the homepage, www.columbia.edu. If users wanted to drill down to archived versions of some columbia.edu webpage, they'd have to enter via one of our captures of the university homepage and navigate from there. This year, I worked with the university archivist to develop a scheme whereby she enters any desired access points to the university collection into a spreadsheet, along with other relevant fields, and a predefined set of groups. And I add those URLs as seeds for access purposes, not capture, and upload the spreadsheet's metadata into Archivit. This system will likely lead to hundreds of additional access points to our archived Columbia web domain, but to start with, we have the 69 visible seeds you see in the slide, divided into the groups you see in the upper left of the slide. This experience of capturing a lot of material in bulk and then retroactively analyzing it for access points has led to some interesting discoveries and helped us add value for archive users. For example, we were surprised to discover within the collection over 25 different student-produced journals, and that several of these journals had already seen one or more URL changes since 2010. As you can see in the slide, this journal, The Current, has had at least 3 URLs during this period, and by sorting the group's seed list by title, you can bring them all together for the user. I think this possibility of providing consolidated access to different versions of a website over time, even when it's changed URLs, is one of the primary potential added values that Web Archive curation can provide to users, and we'll see it again as we turn to examples of website-level MARC records. This Clio MARC record is for the Indonesian NGO Down to Earth, one of 651 site-level records in the Human Rights Collection. With all of our archived website-level MARC records, if the website is still available on the live web at time of cataloging, we include a link to the current site, along with links to the Archivit Wayback Calendar page for the archive site. In this case, as the site's URL changed between March and June of 2011, and we have archival captures of both the earlier and later URLs, links to both are included. All Columbia's MARC records for archived websites are either created in OCLC Connection for WorldCat or are created in our Voyager catalog and later batch uploaded into WorldCat. So a lot of users will have access to these records, and it's important from our perspective that the object of cataloging is the continuing resource itself, including the live website, not simply one archived version of the site. We do add a note saying preserved by Columbia University Libraries Web Resources Collection Program to help explain the presence of the link to the archived version. And this note may be replaced in new records with a more specific 583 note described in Rebecca Gunther's metadata profile as mentioned by Lily. We feel that such a record is more helpful to users than a record pointing only to an archived copy of a living resource or only to a live version that may break in the future. And we feel equally importantly that creating separate records for live and archived versions or websites would be way too burdensome to be sustainable. So speaking of questionably sustainable metadata and access investments, as part of the 2009 to 2012 Mellon grant that allowed Columbia to transform its exploratory web archiving effort into a self-sustained program, funds were allocated for the development of a local access portal, the Human Rights Web Archive, you see on the screen. When Columbia signed on with Archivit in 2008, no partner-supplied metadata was displayed on the public access page at all. Collections were solely lists of seed URLs. Next, the title and description fields were made displayable, but this still left much to be desired. So in our local portal, we created specs for a more user-friendly form of collection browsing. The portal provides tab displays allowing faceted browsing of websites by title, URL, subjects, places, and language. Here's an example of the subjects tab. And it also provides site details records for each website consisting of metadata extracted from the corresponding MARC records in Clio, as well as a screenshot of our first capture of the site that I create manually at the time of cataloging. The site details pages provide links to the Archivit Wayback Calendar pages, and if users drill down to the archived content, they're seeing the content hosted at Archivit, not locally at Columbia. Here's just a quick overview of the mapping showing which MARC fields supply the data in the portal fields. So in addition to browsing, the portal allows full-text search of the collection's work files, which have been downloaded from Archivit in order to be indexed locally. Even though the work data is hosted locally only for indexing purposes, I'll go back to this, we're still talking about the portal here. Since the front-end browsing interface derived from MARC data is much less resource intensive, my hope is that we can sustain the portal by redesigning the search function to take advantage of the Archivit search API as NIARC is doing with Primo, so that we would no longer need to be doing local indexing of the work files. But even that downsizing of the portal would require some programmer time to accomplish. So the question is being considered by libraries upper management as to whether we can do that. So moving on to other collections, the cataloging for the two recent collections that we created collaboratively with other IV Plus libraries, Causeway and CCWA, posed an additional challenge in that we thought that the other participating libraries might want to use the MARC records generated for the archive sites in these collections themselves, and it would be therefore useful to include in the records a series heading for the collection itself. So in this slide you see a Clio website record that is one of 87 hits found by searching the series title, which is Collaborative Architecture, Urbanism, and Sustainability Web Archive, or Causeway. The series heading approach was also taken in our records for contemporary composers web archive, where this record is one of 51 with that series heading. But with the CCWA collection sites records, we went another step, and we added a link to the Archivit collection page for CCWA. So the series heading allows patrons to find all of the related website records from the collection, but the Archivit collection link gets them to the Archivit interface where they can experience and appreciate the collection as a web archive per se, rather than solely drill down to the archived version of one website in isolation. It would be quite labor-intensive for us to apply the series heading idea and collection links retroactively to the records for our 651 human rights seeds and 140 historic preservation seeds. But if I and my bibliographic assistant find the time to chip away at this project, I think we will do it to allow patrons using our catalog who may have no prior familiarity with the existence of web archives to go from happening on a single archived website to broader awareness of our web archive collections. So the lowest, let's see, sorry, hold on this for a second. So the lowest level of granularity is document level metadata. And Columbia's OSMC cataloging unit has a lot of experience cataloging websites and electronic documents available on the web at the request of subject specialists. And for document level records have recently tried whenever possible to link to archived versions of documents from the global Wayback Collection, sometimes using the Internet Archive's Save Page Now function to create an archive link on demand in order to avoid catalog records with broken links. But due to the vast amount of documents captured by our web archiving and our commitment to creating website-level cataloging, we've had little time to create document-level metadata and are daunted by the fact that the crawl reports for the last quarterly crawl of the Human Rights Collection, for example, showed 211,283 PDFs. We did experimentally evaluate a smaller collection, the Historic Preservation Collection, a couple of years ago, and discovered that the amount of substantial PDF publications in that collection was reasonably small, defining substantial as being PDFs of 50 pages or more. And so we went ahead and cataloged all of those. But otherwise, document-level metadata for our archived website is an unaddressed challenge, one that could be assisted by the OCLC metadata tool that Lily mentioned once it is made RDA compliant. So, as those of you who are catalogers know, cataloging work doesn't end with creating bibliographic records, but can also involve authority record work. And in our cataloging of archive websites, we always use subject headings and place names from LCSH, MARC code lists, and other authority files, as well as using the LCNAF for name authorities. But we don't submit nearly as many NACO and headings and SACO proposals as we could be doing. But we have done some, and I view this not as an extension of elaborate labor-intensive traditional bibliographic control into the realm of archived websites, but rather as a way for the important content that we're capturing on the web to itself help shape our bibliographic control thesauri and authority files. So the Human Rights Web Archive includes at least 90 websites representing the organization type National Human Rights Institution. This is an official designation limited to a maximum of one in a given country for permanent bodies established by governments but independent of them to protect human rights. And this term was therefore quite important for our cataloging of this collection, but it didn't exist in LCSH. So we submitted a SACO proposal and added it. And so the fact that this important concept that was very visible in the human rights community and on the web was underrepresented in print publications was mitigated by libraries beginning to consciously collect web resources and catalog them. Similarly, organizations change and evolve frequently, and the LC name authority file often lags behind to the extent that it depends on literary warrant for mostly print publications. So when we added the website for George Soros's Open Society Foundation to the Human Rights Collection, we discovered that that name was relatively new, a change from the Open Society Institute and the Soros Foundation before that. So we updated the existing authority records for the earlier versions of the organization and created the new one for Open Society Foundations. So I began this presentation by pointing out that descriptive metadata on the live web is the only way for users to find archived web content. But all the metadata shown so far depends on our users being aware of our library catalogs and websites with little relevance to search engines or the larger web. When I do searches in Google for organizations whose websites we have archived that I now know to be defunct, I sometimes see within the first few screens hits for our Archivit metadata records for those sites, or for the HRWA portal metadata for those sites. And though it's hard to know how to optimize for these kinds of hits, they are somewhat encouraging. But a small intervention that I've experimented with for a few cases is to edit the Wikipedia articles for the defunct organizations, which may currently include dead links to their now departed websites, adding links to our archived copy, adding links from the Wikipedia records to our archived copy in Archivit. And here I've done this for the Imani Forum Wikipedia record, which now has a link to our archived version of their site since it no longer exists on the live web. And similarly here for the Truth, Justice Reconciliation Commission of Kenya, I did the same thing. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions typically have a charge to investigate and produce a report and then disband. and their important work can disappear if the sites aren't archived, and unless some sort of descriptive metadata is deployed on the live web to link to the archived content. So that's all I have, and I welcome your questions along with discussion with Lily and Nayark about what we've heard today. Thank you.
Thank you both Lily and Alex for your excellent presentations this afternoon. I'd like to now open things up for questions. I mentioned in the chat box, if you have questions, please type them in and I will read them for our speakers and our audience. We have about 9 minutes for questions, so please don't be shy. Any questions? Anyone? All right, it doesn't appear that we have any questions this afternoon. Lily or Alex, any final remarks before we sign off?
No, just thank you for inviting us to speak. Thank you for those who attended. I hope that for those of you who had problems with audio, perhaps it'll be improved in the recording and we can distribute that, and hopefully that'll fill any gaps if there were some problems in hearing either my talk or some of Alex's. But thanks again, Sumitra. Thanks for inviting me to be included today.
Yes, we really enjoyed hearing from both of you. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to all of our attendees for registering and joining us for today's webinar. A reminder that part 4 of our series, which is the final webinar, will be held on Monday, March 28th at 3 p.m. And we'll be making recordings and slides available to all attendees. They'll be distributed to you later in the week, as Davis has just mentioned in the chat box. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.